great to know that the informal sharing is happening as well. So we're just standing by until we kick off in another couple of minutes. And I want to also give a nod to our webinar production team today. Jenny Stern-Carasone is our webinar producer. Shanna Russ is our audio producer. I want to thank Lily Hine for her marketing work for today's webinar. And just a minute or two from kicking off. And here's a quick snapshot of the agenda today. Most of the presentation will be focused on the findings from the study of online credit recovery in Algebra I. And we'll have a couple of responses from Wisconsin and Iowa, and then plenty of time for Q&A. We have 90 minutes this afternoon. So if you have questions, the public chat room there at the lower left is the place to say hello and also to enter either clarifying or content related questions as we go along. And our moderators, Pam and Peggy, will do their best to basket those into a holding pen for our presenters as we go. So I'm getting the signal from our technical team that we're ready to kick off. So at this time, Jenny, webinar producer, you can switch to the main session. And at this for the Virtual Education Research Alliance at REL Midwest. And good afternoon, Pam, and handing over to you.
Peter, thank you so much for keeping everyone abreast of what's going on this afternoon. We certainly are excited to hear from researchers today and practitioners. And on behalf of the Virtual Education Research Alliance, and you'll hear more about us in just a little bit, welcome to everyone. We have a great webinar in store, and as Peter indicated, get your questions ready because Jessica and Kirk, our two researchers, will be happy to answer those, as will our two practitioners, Gail and Michelle. So let's just talk a little bit about who we are and why we're here. Peter already spoke a little bit, for those of you who joined early, about the RELs. There are 10 RELs.
Your microphone has been turned on.
We happen to be REL Midwest of the 7 Midwestern states. And a big shout out to Wisconsin. It looks like they win the grand prize as far as the number of participants today. The study was focused in the Midwest, but we know that the research findings are going to have implications for all of you, no matter where you're located. Let's just focus a little bit on REL Midwest and what we have focused on doing with our alliances. We're all focused on improving student academic outcomes. I think that's universal across our whole country. And we're really trying to focus on using research data to inform practice. But as we'll talk in just a moment, it's not a one-way street, and we know that Kirk and Jessica will say that as well. The practitioner feedback to the researchers is really critical for the work that we do in the REL Midwest, and particularly as we talk now about the Virtual Education Research Alliance. So we use research alliances to do that sort of feedback loop, the research to the practitioner and back. And we work very much with alliance members to identify what's important to them so that the researchers are carrying out the correct research. So our Virtual Education Research Alliance are these 5 members. Their lives every day deal with online learning, online schools, online courses. And in the case of our first member of the Alliance, Mary Herring, she is deeply involved in teacher and administrator preparation, again with the focus to make sure that we're preparing teachers and administrators to support online learning. As you can see on the screen, we have participants in our alliance from the Kirkwood High School Completion Program in Iowa Learning Online, and you'll hear from one of the staff members today, Kale, who is with Iowa Learning Online, and Wisconsin Virtual School. And you will hear today from Michelle Nichols of Wisconsin Virtual School. I would like to take this opportunity to turn this over to my colleague, Peggy Clements. And Peggy is our lead researcher, and I am the facilitator. But Peggy, I'm going to let you introduce yourself and take it away telling people what they'll expect today.
Great. Thanks very much, Pam. Before I go over the goals and agenda for today's session, I'd like to start with just a little bit of background about how we came to producing this event today. According to a nationally representative survey of U.S. school districts that was conducted by the U.S. Department of Education's National Center for Education Statistics a couple of years ago, one of the most common reasons why districts enroll students in online courses was to provide them with opportunities for credit recovery, to recover course credit for courses that they failed. I've known that Drs. Heppen and Walters and their collaborators have been working on this study, the one that's going to be the focus for today's presentation, working on it for a number of years. And I had the opportunity to hear them present about it at an education research conference in the fall. I was really intrigued and impressed by the study. It's very thoughtful and rigorous and relevant, and I wanted to help them disseminate the finding to a broad audience, and particularly an audience that included a number of practitioners who I know are with us today. So given that little bit of background, let me just go over our goals for the event today. Our goals are that you're going to leave the session understanding the results of the efficacy of online credit in Algebra I study, both in terms of the impact on student outcomes as well as how math instruction was provided in different versions of the course. That you'll have an increased understanding of the kinds of support that students may need when taking an online credit recovery course, and that you'll have the opportunity to participate in a conversation about the implications of the study's findings today. Here's the overview of our agenda. In a couple of minutes, I'll be turning it over to the presenters. We'll start with Jessica Heppen and Kirk Walters, and they'll present about the study that they've conducted with their collaborators. We'll take some time to answer questions before we move then to our practitioner voices. As Pam mentioned a second ago, please feel free to post any questions or comments you have in the chat box as we go along, and we'll be doing our best to keep an eye on them, and we'll bring them to the presenters at different points. So before we get started, I am curious, and I think some of our presenters will also be curious, in what motivated you to join us today. So in particular, what's your current interest in online credit recovery? Is your school or district currently using online courses for credit recovery? Are you considering implementing online credit recovery in the future? Or do you just hope generally to learn more about the topic? If you want to add anything to any of these options, please feel free to do so in the chat box. Give it just a second to hear from people. All right. Well, it looks, actually, this is really interesting. It looks like a mix between schools and districts that are using online courses for credit recovery, and a big chunk of people who are also just interested in learning more about the topic, and some people also considering using online credit recovery. All right. So thanks very much. So at this point, I'd like to introduce our presenters and hand it over to them. Dr. Jessica Heppen is a managing researcher at American Institute of Research, where her work focuses primarily on technology, mathematics, and data use in secondary schools, with an emphasis on improving academic outcomes for diverse learners. She's designed and led multiple studies of online learning in secondary schools, including 2 large-scale randomized controlled trials examining the effects of online Algebra I courses. One of these studies examined the effects of offering an online course to broaden 8th graders' access to Algebra I, and focused on students' academic achievements and their later course-taking patterns in high school. She'll be presenting about the second study today. Dr. Hepburn has also led a series of studies investigating educators' use of data and web-based data systems for driving educational decisions. These include the Urban Data Study, which looked at the use of interim assessment data for instructional improvement in urban school districts, and an investigation of educators' use of data dashboards with a focus on analysis and visualization of weblog usage data. Dr. Kirk Walters is a principal researcher at AIR, where his research focuses on understanding ways to improve K-12 mathematics teaching and learning. In addition to his work on the efficacy of online credit recovery, in addition to his work on the efficacy of online credit recovery study with Dr. Hepburn, he's the principal investigator of a large-scale randomized trial of a double-period blended algebra course developed by Achieveme. He also directs the Promoting Student Success in Algebra I study, which provides practitioners and policymakers with evidence on how to improve algebra achievement for struggling students, and is the Deputy Director of the IES of the U.S. Department of Education's Math Professional Development Study, a large-scale experimental evaluation of an intensive, content-focused professional development program on fourth-grade teachers' knowledge, classroom practices, and their students' achievement. Before entering graduate school, Dr. Walters spent 9 years as an urban middle school and high school math teacher in the Los Angeles and Washington, D.C. metro areas, serving as a department chair, mentor teacher, and professional development facilitator. Big thanks to Jessica and Kirk for joining us today. And Jessica, I'm going to hand it off to you now.
Great, Peggy. Thank you so much for that introduction. It was excellent. And thanks, everyone, for joining us today. We're really glad to have a chance to talk to you about our online credit recovery study, which we also affectionately call the Back on Track study. And as Peggy said, we're really interested in making sure that what we're learning from this study is getting out in the right ways to the right people and people who play a role in offering credit recovery and online learning opportunities for particular kinds of students. Our focus in this study is on struggling ninth graders who've been unsuccessful in Algebra I, and online credit recovery options, as you all know, are increasingly made available to them. Our study is a collaboration between the American Institutes for Research and the University of Chicago Consortium on Chicago School Research. So listed on this slide are the names of our incredible study team that are located at both organizations. All right, so I'm going to give you some background for the study, lay the groundwork, and much of this will be familiar to all of you. So I'll move fairly quickly through it so we can share with you some of our findings to date. We all know that credit early in high school, particularly in the ninth grade, is a powerful predictor of whether students eventually graduate, and that in many districts, more students fail Algebra I than any other course. And the consequences of algebra failure are really staggering. By some estimates, in the Chicago Public Schools, for example, where our study takes place, only 13% of students who failed Algebra I as freshmen several years ago graduated on time. So clearly, finding ways to get kids back on track and focus on early intervention is of utmost importance. And by early, obviously, we all know that we could go back much earlier and should. Here we're focused on early in high school. And so online courses are increasingly being used to expand opportunities for credit recovery. We designed this study to address the fact that there is no rigorous evidence on their effectiveness for this purpose. And really, in fact, there's little research in general about credit recovery and whether and under what conditions students can get back on track. So a little more about online learning for this purpose. This is one of the fastest growing areas of K-12 online education, as Peggy noted. There's national research that documents this. Seems to be especially the case in urban districts where failure rates are high. There's reason to believe that in addition to additional flexibility that's created for schools by online learning opportunities and convenience aspects to it, that there may actually be benefits for students who fail. And that a theory of action for how online courses could disrupt a process of increasing academic failure could have to do with there being a different mode of instruction than the failed face-to-face course, that they can be interactive and graphically rich, that they can be flexible and have individualized pacing, and that students get immediate feedback on assignments and assessments. So our study is funded by a grant from the U.S. Department of Education at the Institute of Education Sciences, and it was designed to achieve these goals. So first, to test the efficacy of online versus face-to-face Algebra I for credit recovery on academic outcomes. Is one or the other more beneficial for students, and in what ways? Second, to determine the implementation conditions that support student success. So we collected a lot of data about implementation of the online course and also face-to-face in order to get a better understanding of what is credit recovery. You know, when students take summer credit recovery courses or credit recovery courses at other times during the year, what is the nature of those courses? What is the content of those courses? How do they run? And then third, to gauge whether and how early credit recovery helps at-risk students get back on track by following them over time. Okay, so the goals for our presentation today, I'll take the first one and I'll pass it to my colleague Kirk Walters for the second one, is first to compare the relative effects of online and face-to-face credit recovery in algebra on academic outcomes, and I'll walk through those. And then I'll pass it to Kirk to describe the nature and content of both types of courses. So a little bit about our study design. We randomly assigned students to classes within high schools in Chicago, and I'll give you a sense of the numbers in a minute. But we offered online and face-to-face credit recovery sections in each school. The online course was provided by Aventa Learning, which merged with K-12 over the course of the project. And we selected this course because it was in wide use in Chicago and viewed increasingly wide use, and was viewed favorably in the district for supporting at-risk students. And it's a model that you're probably familiar with. In this case, students had access to both an online teacher, which was provided by Aventa, and an in-class mentor, who was a staff person at their school. And we compared it to typical face-to-face Algebra I summer classes. So this took place over the summer, in summer 2011 and in summer 2012. So here you see the sample sizes for the study. In 2011, we were in 15 CPS high schools, and a total, if you move over a few columns to the N students total column, we randomly assigned about 600 students to either online or face-to-face, for an average of about 16 students per section. In summer 2012, we were in 13 high schools, and there was overlap in the years. We randomly assigned about 800 kids that year, and had an average of about 20 students per section. We randomly assigned students on site, so when they showed up, we didn't do it based on the lists of students who had failed. Those only came out mere days before summer school started. So we did an on-site random assignment procedure where members of our study team worked with every school to receive the students as they showed up and conduct random assignment, and then they would go to their classes. This produced two statistically comparable groups successfully, and about 90% of the sample were first-time freshmen, and this was really our target population. For the results that we'll share today, we focus on this sample. So I want to give you a bit of a sense of who these students are and what their characteristics are, who failed second semester algebra and who showed up. Right? Who were the kids who arrived at summer school willing to attempt credit recovery? Demographically, we see that the students who failed were not very different from students who passed. They were more likely to be male and African American with higher neighborhood poverty, absence rates, and suspension rates. But these weren't large, substantial differences. They were clearly lower performing students, as you would expect. They have substantially lower grade point averages and math achievement scores, and they were more likely to be considered off track and to have failed other courses. So the issue of getting back on track has to do with, how far off track are students. We certainly had a distribution in that way and had many students who had failed multiple courses. Of the students who failed, those who attempted credit recovery and those who showed up for summer school, they were slightly more likely to be Latino, and they had lower absence and suspension rates than students who did not, and that was demographically what we observed. Gives you a sense of the student population with which we were working in this study. So I'll give you a quick overview of how this went, and then Kirk will pick up on several of these themes in his portion. So as I said, we implemented these credit recovery courses in summer 2011 and in summer 2012. In 2011, when we had about 600 students, you'll recall, we offered 36 sections total, half online, half face-to-face. And there were 2 summer sessions, though the start and end dates varied for schools. Most of these lasted about 3.5 to 4 weeks for a total of 60 hours. So this is compressed. This is for a half credit second semester algebra course, which is tends to be the harder part of the course for students, and the failure rates are higher. We didn't see any major technology issues occur in summer 2011. In summer 2012, same courses, offered 40 sections total, half online and half face-to-face. And we had 2 distinct 3-week summer sessions. This was just a change in district policy that year, with district-mandated start and end dates, even more compressed, and again, 60 hours. So students and teachers were present at school for long days, and some of them went 4 days a week, and some of them went 5 days a week. We saw technology problems in the second session of summer 2, where the online course provider upgraded their underlying platform, and it created system instability for all of the schools for parts of the first week of the 3-week summer session. And we can talk about that and take questions about that if people have them. Just a nod to the content of the courses. Kirk is going to talk about this, but just to set the context for the results that we'll present, the online course is a second semester algebra course, as I mentioned, and it didn't allow students to go forward into another course like Geometry or Algebra 2, and it didn't allow students to go back into first semester algebra or pre-algebra. The face-to-face course, the content was determined by teachers as typical. These were typical summer school Algebra I courses in the district. And we found by collecting classroom materials that they offered a mix of pre-algebra, semester 1, and semester 2 algebra. And you'll hear more about that from Kirk in a couple of minutes. So I'm going to, in the next few slides, share results through the second year of high school for both cohorts combined, again, focusing on that first-time freshman sample, on the outcomes that you see on this slide. In terms of short-term outcomes, we look at student math attitudes and engagement in school, the grades in the credit recovery class, and whether or not they recovered successfully the credit, and an end-of-course algebra assessment that we administered at the end of each of the online and face-to-face course sections. In terms of longer-term outcomes, we'll look at algebra achievement scores on the PLAN test, which some of you may be familiar. It's considered the pre-ACT that students in Chicago take in the fall of 10th grade. We'll look at math course taking during the second year of high school and rates of being on track by the end of the second year of high school. In later analyses, we'll examine outcomes for students later in high school into their third and fourth year, and ultimately graduation outcomes. So let's take a look and see what we know so far. So here we see results comparing online and face-to-face students. All of our analyses will compare the online group to the face-to-face group. In this case, on student attitudes that we measured with the end-of-course survey. And just to orient you to the graph, if the diamond-shaped dot is to the right of 0, it means that online students were on average higher than face-to-face students. So it's kind of the online average minus the face-to-face average. So if it's over there, online was higher. And if it's to the left of 0, it means the face-to-face students were higher on average than the online students. So in terms of the results, when we look at measured self-reported engagement, perceived classroom personalism, perceived usefulness of mathematics, how useful is math, and teacher expectations or their sense of the academic press related to teacher expectations, we didn't see any significant differences between online and face-to-face students. The dot that's encircled in red toward the top of the graph showed that face-to-face students had higher liking, reported liking, and confidence in math on average. The next one that's circled shows that online students perceived their course as more difficult than students in the face-to-face class. And the third is that face-to-face students perceived the course to have more clarity in terms of the grading expectations and what they needed to do in order to succeed. All right, so consistent with the perception that the online course was more difficult, we also saw that the grades were higher in the face-to-face classes. So this graph shows the distribution of grades, A's, B's, C's, etc., for students in the face-to-face classes on the left and the online course to the right. So you can see two things from this graph. First, that overall the grades were higher in the face-to-face course. There were more, and there were more passing grades, second, in the class. So that second means that more students in the face-to-face courses successfully recovered credit by passing the class than did students in the online condition. So 76% of face-to-face students and 66% of online students successfully recovered credit as part of the study. And that's a significant difference. It's important to note, though, that the majority of students in both groups successfully recovered their credit this summer after 9th grade. All right, so looking at algebra achievement, here are the results from two different math assessments that I mentioned a minute ago. The first is a post-test, which was made up of released NAEP items that we administered ourselves as a study team. And so here you can see at the top of the graph, this works the same way to the left of the graph. The face-to-face scores were higher than the online scores. That the face-to-face students scored significantly higher on the algebra post-test. And the dots underneath the encircled dot separate the post-test scores by strand score. So we divided the items that fell into pre-algebra topics, those that represent first semester algebra topics, and those that represent second semester algebra topics. And on all of those, the face-to-face students outperformed the online students. But on the plan test, that pre-ACT, there were no significant differences. The dots fall to the right of 0, meaning that the online scores were higher than the face-to-face scores, but they were not significant differences. And again, this is a test that was administered in the fall of 10th grade, and it yields an overall math score and an algebra subtest score, and there weren't differences on either of these tests. Okay, so now taking a look at course taking. We didn't find any differences by condition in math course-taking patterns for study students in their second year of high school. We saw that virtually 100% of students take geometry the next year, regardless of whether they were officially 10th graders or whether they had yet passed Algebra I. And about half of the students pass geometry, both in the first semester and the second semester. So those taking and passing bars they're blue for online and they're gray for face-to-face, and those are the top 4 sets of bars that you see there, and they're very consistent and essentially the same by condition. The bottom set of bars are on-track rates for the end of the second year of high school. We found no significant differences between the groups in likelihood of being on track by the end of the next year of high school, and that less than 20% of both groups were on track based on the Consortium on Chicago School Research's on-track measure. So some conclusions from these results. For some short-term outcomes, face-to-face appeared to benefit students more than online. They had higher grades and pass rates. There were higher post-test scores, especially for students we found in follow-up analyses who had many course failures. As I mentioned, we had a distribution of students, and some of them had many course failures. Interestingly, we found higher post-test scores among students in the face-to-face group who had many course failures. But most students, again, they were successful in both, and there's little difference, as you saw, in outcomes the following academic year. We think it's really interesting that the online course is perceived as harder, and in additional analyses, we learned further that students with higher ability, higher prior achievement scores found the face-to-face course easier, as you'd expect. But students of all ability levels, all incoming or prior achievement levels, found the online course similarly difficult, which we think is an important finding to continue to explore. I think we're going to pause at this point and hear from you, your questions and comments.
That's right. Jessica, thanks so much. So just a couple of things. I just posted this in the chat, but I'm going to post it again. I just want to make sure everybody remembers that there's a full paper version of the study that Jessica and Kirk are presenting on right to the right of the chat box. The paper on this study is the Back on Track study file. There was one question, Jessica, that I thought you'd want to address. So in response to the slide, number 21 slide, where it shows the percentage of students in the two conditions who had A's, B's, C's, and D's, someone wanted to know if that was a percentage of the students just the students who completed the course, or if those represented the percentages of all students who had enrolled in the courses.
Great question, and I didn't talk through the bars underneath the 0% line. So it's all students, and the full distributions show the percent of A's, B's, C's, D's above the line. That's the passing mark. And then below the line, there are two groups of students who finished the course but failed it. And those percentages are fairly low, about 10%. And then the other group of students are students who did not receive a grade in the district file, and they're students who dropped the course or were dropped. The district policy students are to be dropped if they miss more than one day, so if they miss 2 days, because those days are so full of instructional time, and many students drop on their own. So those rates are about 20% across conditions. Students who came to summer school, attempted credit recovery, they were randomly assigned to a course, and they either never showed up again or they dropped at some point. So all the students in the study are represented in those graphs.
Thanks, Jessica. I'm seeing a number of questions that I think that Kirk's presentation is going to address, as well as a really interesting point that I think we want to save for our conversation towards the end of the session. But let's go ahead and move on to Kirk. Kirk, you have control of the slides, so move forward when you're ready to go.
Great. Thanks a lot. So I'd like to spend about 10 minutes talking about the content of the online and the face-to-face courses that we just described the results of and that we implemented over the 2 summers. And so the question I'd like to answer is, how do these courses compare in terms of the nature of the math that was included in those courses? And by nature of the math, I'd like to talk about the topics that were covered. They were both Algebra 1B courses, but as you might imagine, and Jessica mentioned that the face-to-face teachers had discretion in terms of establishing their syllabi, and less so with the online course. So we'll talk about how the topics compared between both courses. We'll also talk about the sequencing, so how the topics were ordered, and the knowledge emphasis. And I think there was a question about traditional versus more problem-solving applied reform teaching, and I'll try to touch on that through a discussion of the content. I also saw another question about the structure of the online course, and just to clarify, the online kids were in labs where they took the online course, obviously, but they did have a mentor, proctor, who was there with them. Most of the time it was a certified teacher, almost always, but not necessarily a math teacher. And the face-to-face kids had math teachers who agreed to teach during the summer. So that was the general structure. in terms of the data that we collected to answer this question about the nature of the content, so with the online course, we had a lot more fine-grained detail related to the topics that were covered, how far individual kids progressed, and their performance on the built-in assessments that were included with the course. We did, to the extent possible, we tried to get as many of the face-to-face course materials as possible. And since teachers had discretion, the face-to-face teachers had discretion about how they built their syllabi and the courses that they brought in, those materials varied in terms of how detailed they were. So in some cases, we might have gotten a syllabi that had all of the topics that they were going to teach, and in some cases, lessons nested within topics, but not down to the individual problem level. In other cases, we had teachers that submitted every handout or every lesson that they pulled together, and there were exercises and worksheets and so forth. So it varied, but at a high level, we were able to identify the topics that were covered across all of the face-to-face course materials. But that's just a little bit of, it's worth noting that our online course data were much more precise than our face-to-face course data. We also surveyed the teachers to get a sense of their grading criteria, the extent to which they based grades on effort versus assessments. And then also, we mentioned, guess what, I'm in a school, and I just heard the loudspeaker. I hope you're not hearing that, but it makes this webinar much more real. The post-test scores that Jessica mentioned, looking at the impact analyses where we broke out the post-tests by first semester algebra, that's Algebra 1A, second semester Algebra 1B or pre-algebra. We were also interested in seeing if there were differences on those subscores based on the nature of the content. So let me just jump right in here. Topics. Well, the online course was essentially, you can consider it similar to an online textbook. This was a few years ago. There are different types of online courses. This one was organized by units. There were 5 units and 24 lessons nested within those units. The units were those that you would typically see in the back half of a traditional algebra book. Systems of equations, rationals, things like that, polynomials. Kids did not have the option to go back and look at pre-algebra or 1A material. If that were to happen, it would require moving outside of the course and having a mentor give them, prior work. But they typically they spent summer school focusing on 1B in the online course. In the face-to-face courses, it was quite a mix. And when we looked at the high level, like the syllabi level, and the annotated tables of contents in cases where face-to-face teachers use textbooks, it averaged out to about a little less than a 60% emphasis on Algebra 1B across those syllabi. So 40% of the time, roughly, they were doing first semester algebra and pre-algebra content, which was not surprising given where these kids were and that they were struggling. And some of the kids in our sample failed not only second semester, but first semester algebra. So the variability across those face-to-face courses was also really interesting. In some cases, we had the full range. So there were 1B face-to-face classes that were 100% Algebra 1B. And we also had some that had no Algebra 1B content. It was all pre-algebra and Algebra 1 content across the face-to-face courses. The sequencing of the topics for the online, it was very traditional in the sense that there were, lessons nested within units, and then units were organized, like a chapter in a textbook. And for those on the phone that have looked at math textbooks, I don't think there'd be anything surprising about the topics that were there or how they were sequenced. And then in the face-to-face courses, it was really a wide range of sequencing. In some cases, it was a textbook that they used, but they didn't necessarily follow the chapters sequentially or the lessons within chapters sequentially. In some cases, the teachers pulled together their own materials where there wasn't a clear structure to how those lessons were knitted together. And as we looked across those face-to-face materials, we determined that almost 30% of them were really out of sequence, where we couldn't find a logical organizational structure to how the topics were organized. So there was a difference there. Knowledge emphasis, we were also interested in how procedural versus conceptual versus more application, problem solving, those kinds of opportunities. And I think given the nature of the Common Core and what's going to be on the Smarter Balanced and the PARCC assessments, this is increasingly relevant. In the online course, I think it was organized like a traditional textbook, and it was more procedural than conceptual, to be sure. But there were opportunities for there were animations and little applets and things where kids could click on a video and there might be a connection to the real world. There was some attention to conceptual understanding, but there were a lot of exercises and a lot of procedures in the online course as well. The face-to-face course, at least based on the materials that at that fine-grained level, when we were able to review the exercises and the worksheets and so forth, they were almost entirely procedural. So we found that, and this was consistent in our classroom observations as well, that the face-to-face classes tended to be more worksheet-driven, more exercise-driven, and of course the content is more on the 1A and the pre-algebra side of things, which I already mentioned. So I think I'm almost out of time. Taking a step back and looking at the two courses, and you now know how kids did. We know that the kids in the online course perceived it to be more difficult. And when you look at the materials, you look at the content itself was true second semester algebra. I mentioned that we had data on course progression, and the online kids completed about 2/3 of, about 60% of those 5 units. They completed almost 3 of the 5 unit exams on average. But within those 5 units, the content was more difficult than what the face-to-face kids were exposed to. And one question is, was it just too hard? Was it too hard? Was it too short of a time to master that content? Another question, which is almost counterintuitive, you think about online courses and technology with the potential to be adaptive and to be potentially more targeted to individual students' needs. Well, the face-to-face class, those teachers really did adjust what they were doing. Presumably, they adjust their curriculum based on where their kids were by looking at their prior knowledge and skills and focusing on 1A and pre-algebra content. On the flip side, it was a 1B course, and what is this balance between there's remediation that needs to take place, and yet there's rigor that also needs to be achieved, and I think this is an ongoing challenge for educators, trying to find the right balance of giving students opportunities to learn new, more challenging material, and yet recognizing that sometimes prior knowledge and skills, deficits in those areas can interfere with that, with learning that content. And finally, when you think about the emphasis, especially now with PARCC and Smarter Balance, I was at a school today where, a high school, where teachers were talking about how big of a deal this Algebra II, especially in the era of the Common Core, is, and how much harder the high school content standards are than what used to be, I'm in Florida right now, on their state test. It's going to be even harder conceptually, and so determining how much of algebra needs to be mastered, the kind of content, how much and how well do you need to know algebra in order to progress, is something that we're going to continue to struggle with, and it's probably going to keep going up and up in terms of what kids need to be able to do to succeed with the higher standards. So, all of this information that we collected in this study, I think, will continue to be important topics of conversation, not only in the context of credit recovery, but in just general mastery of algebra and what it means to be successful in high school math. So I think I am officially out of time here.
That was great,
yeah.
Kirk. Thank you so much. So I think in your really, very interesting comments that you made at the end of your presentation, I think to some extent you addressed one of these questions, but somebody posed the question, did some students have skills below the Algebra 1B level? Did they have the necessary prerequisites to begin the course? And if not, how did students get the necessary skills to begin the Algebra 1B course? Before I hand it back to you and Jessica to answer this question, one of the things I want to point out, and I'd like to hear from our practitioner presenters as well, is my take is that when many schools are using online for credit recovery, that's not necessarily something that they make sure happens, right? To make sure that kids are actually really where they need to be taking this online course. That a kid fails a course, and so the solution then is to enroll them in an online course. So I think that's what happens a lot in the field. But then to address, have you or Jessica address this question about were kids ready for Algebra 1? As you'll see, as everyone will see, the chat box has now been made a lot bigger. Please continue to post your questions and thoughts in this box. It's great to hear how interested people are and how people are really interpreting some of the findings. Go ahead, Kirk and Jess.
Do you want me to? I'm happy to take a crack at it. So
Sure.
It's a good question. When we designed the study, we did wonder if we should focus on first semester algebra or second semester algebra. And on average, in Chicago, which isn't surprising, a higher percentage of kids fail the second semester. So we thought we'd have a bigger pool of students. We wanted to expand access in a needy course, and that seemed to be the way to go. Clearly, there were kids that not only had failed the first semester of algebra that were taking the second semester course. There were also those that probably passed but didn't learn what they needed to learn. To answer your question, yeah, a lot of the kids didn't have what they needed, but that's probably true for many of the kids that took Algebra 1B during the school year as well, at least in the schools and with the population with which we were working.
Yeah, sounds good. And thanks very much. And so Susan Lowe's just posed this question. So she asks, are you saying that we're comparing one poorly designed online course with a variety of well and not so well designed face-to-face courses? Jess, would you address that for us, please?
Sure. I think it's a great question. So the study was designed to compare an example of a very widely used model, in particular, but also one that represented lots of other models of online courses that are used for credit recovery. And at the time, what Chicago liked about this particular course was that they experienced in trial runs of it that at-risk students got additional support from online teachers, and they were very interested in mentor practices. So what should in-class mentors do to best support student learning? I think that so the study was designed to be a really policy-relevant test of what's in wide use out there. We had to pick one. We could have made the study huge, and we could have picked many different course providers and compared all of those and compared those to face-to-face. But what we really wanted was a model that would be familiar to many people and sound familiar and look familiar. And as Kirk said, in terms of content, it was what was expected. And in terms of how the course operated, it was what was expected in terms of kids having an online teacher and in-class mentor. So it kind of ticked all those boxes. you know, what we've done, because we collected so much implementation data, because we're all really interested in this, you know, we kind of pick them apart, which doesn't mean that there aren't many ways to think about improving on both face-to-face and online credit recovery, and thinking about the kinds of supports that, especially as technology advances, that students, particularly at-risk students, could benefit from. So no, I mean, it wasn't designed to compare a poorly designed course to, you know, a mix of poorly designed courses. It was really to provide some high quality information about what's happening nationally out there, particularly in urban districts.
Thanks, Jess. And so I'm going to actually just elaborate a little bit to address the most recent question we have from guests, which is, you know, to clarify how students were brought up to the skill level needed to successfully complete the online course. And Jess, interrupt me if you think I'm misstating this, but, you know, my take from what you just said and what I know about the study was that the study was really designed to look at a typical and like what was really happening out in the world of how schools are using online courses. I mean, I remember you all talking about how, you know, the Chicago Public Schools, you know, helped you identify the online course because it was one that they liked and they thought would be a good partner for the study. And I think, as you just said, that this really represented what we know about how schools are typically using online courses. It wasn't necessarily this is something new and different. Am I right about that?
Yeah, that is right. And, you know, it was a really collaborative process at the time of, you know, co-developing the research questions that guided the study, and really making sure that the district's burgeoning interest in expanding credit recovery opportunities through online courses were represented. So a focus on, you know, understanding the mentor practices and the roles of the mentors, and as you said, using an online course provider that they had an established relationship with.
Yeah, sounds good. Let's see. I want to make sure that we don't get too far behind. So one of the things I hear, so Susan wrote that, you know, I understand the reasoning and the constraints, which all make sense, but it does give online learning a bad rap. I don't think that's what we're setting out to do per se, and in fact, it may be a good time for us to move to talking to our practitioner presenters, because we really want to hear, these are people who are involved in a day-to-day way, thinking about the best ways to use online courses to support students' learning. And so both of our presenters are going to talk a bit about what they think the study has to tell us about the effective use, or informing the effective use of online learning. And we'll have more time for questions at the end, so keep them coming. And Jessica and Kirk, thanks so much. I want to remind everybody that the slides are available in our today's files, so if you wanted to look at some of those graphs a little bit more closely, they're there, as well as the paper, which is a bit more technical, but also has a bit more information. Okay, so now let's go to our other presenters. We have Cale Rowe, who is the Student Services Consultant from Iowa Learning Online. Prior to taking on this current role, Cale was a teacher working with students who are at risk for failing, for dropping out. And in fact, he started his career as a teacher in the Chicago public school system. We also have Michelle Nichols, who is the director currently of the Wisconsin Virtual School. I'm actually just realizing that I missed that there's a typo. This is actually the name of Michelle's program is Wisconsin Virtual School. And she's going to tell you a little bit actually about some of her interests related to this and some of her background. So let's start with Cale. Cale, you have control over the mouse to forward the slides at your leisure. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm Cale Rowe. It says I'm the Student Services Consultant. My job up until this January was an at-risk teacher at a high school in Iowa, and I actually ran the summer school program where we used an online program where there was multiple different classes or multiple classes going on, and I was facilitating all of them as well. I did want to start off by saying I think it is wonderful with the research study of all the new opportunities that students in CPS had to take summer school. And one of the great things about online courses is that it can expand the amount of not just the number of courses available, but sometimes how many students we can fit as well. It can be pretty tough sometimes for a district to have all of the certified teachers that they have or that they need for the summer. It can be a tough thing for schools. So I didn't want to just say it was a great, I really enjoyed reading about the research. So as we move on here, next, a few of the things I'm going to talk about are how to support students first going into an online class. So one thing with taking an online class is that students may have different expectations about what that's going to involve. Sorry, one moment. Sorry about that. I'm just getting over a cold and I'm coughing a little bit. When a student goes in to take an online class, they may have their own expectations about what that's going to be. But it's very important as a teacher or as a school to talk to the students not only about the coursework they're going to take, but how does the online class work? They need to have an introduction to not only navigating the system, but knowing who they talk to if they have issues, having a very clear expectation of how they can contact their teacher if that person is at a distance, how quickly they'll get responses back, as well as what the role of the facilitator is going to be. A lot of times it's going to be the first time a student has taken an online class, and it's really important that they know what that's going to be when they go in. Most of our students have taken classes in the traditional setting for years and years, for much of their education. And if we're going to flip how that looks, it's important to give the students fair warning and give them some training on how to use the system. I tend to make the comparison of professional development in a school. Whenever we have a new system as teachers, whether it's a new student information system, a new email system at work, curriculum mapping, whatever it may be, it takes different teachers different amounts of time before they really start to get the hang of just basic navigation and functionality. Our kids need that too, and that's important to consider as you start to ramp up something. Furthermore, when students hear that they have an online class, they might automatically think that it's easier. A lot of our kids have a great deal of experience being online and maybe talking with their friends online, playing games, doing a lot of social networking and whatnot. But they may not have a lot of experience being online to get a task completed. They might not have a lot of experience going online to learn for long periods of time. So it can take some self-discipline and a lot of time management skills as well. So as I mentioned, just as students go into online learning, it can be a really big shift for them. And the setting routine methods of communication are very important to get started. Going next down the list, as the school starts to look at adding new online classes or start to tweak the program that they have, it's really important that the facilitators know what their role is. Just as it might be a new experience for students, it might be for the facilitator as well. And one of the things that person can do is start to plan interventions for students as they struggle. I know there was a question about helping students who came into that algebra class, helping them recover maybe some pre-algebra skills. This is important as a facilitator going in to a class, that you're going to have some students who need remediation almost immediately. And knowing that going in can really help you scaffold and plan for a way that that student can get caught up and start to really master that material and build off of it. Depending on the subject area, knowledge builds on itself. And if a student has poor pre-algebra skills, they're going to need a plan in place to help them get those stronger as they learn and build up to algebra, etc. Kind of taking a little bit of a step back from just the classroom setting. When a school is looking at online classes, I know that Kurt had mentioned that the content wasn't always exactly the same when they had compared it during the study. And it's very important for a school, if you're going to, say, purchase content or use an online class from another party, whether it's a sharing agreement with another school, whether it's a offsite provider. It's important that the school takes a look at that curriculum and sees not only how it aligns to the written curriculum of the school, but then also to the practice curriculum that's going on in the classrooms. As Kirk had mentioned, a lot of times when the teacher is in the classroom, they have the ability to adjust and really adjust things to try to reach students at their level, and that's important. And it's just necessary to make sure that that alignment is accurate. It can happen where the online class might be more rigorous than what has been taught in the schools. I know he had mentioned that a lot of the state tests and whatnot are really increasing their rigor. Moving on to instruction. This is important when picking an online provider or starting to develop those resources as your own building, is to see how much flexibility the teacher has for pacing and support in the classroom. Can the instructor or facilitator easily add resources to their class? Can they, on the fly, build up that scaffolding as students start to struggle or have extra questions? And then moving on to assessments, it's really important that students not only receive timely feedback, but that feedback is helpful and useful. And that can sometimes be difficult in an online program if there's a lot of maybe multiple choice, or if there's a lot of true-false sorts of questions. But however the assessments are set up, it's important that that feedback is timely and also really directed to that specific learner. And finally, one recommendation I have is, as you're setting up a program like this, is to look at the goal of the program. I think there are many obvious benefits of just being able to add opportunities for students, maybe increase the number of courses offered, whatever it may be, but it's important to determine what your goal is and how that's going to be successful. There was some comparisons to students who were in the face-to-face classroom as well as online classroom, and it did appear that there weren't too many negative aspects of students taking the online class, and seeing how does that fit with the school as far as being able to provide more opportunities for students. So whatever measures of success you set up for your program, it's really important to look at the bigger picture. And while online learning isn't perfect yet, nothing is, it can do a great job of really providing more opportunities for students, a little bit more flexibility for schools. And when students are struggling early in 9th grade, if we can provide more on-time credit recovery so that a student who fails a course doesn't have to wait 6 months, doesn't have to wait 9 months. There's a lot of value in that. And in any given school, resources are limited, and students who are struggling may need to take a course either over a longer period of time or more than once, and that can be a difficult thing for schools to provide. In closing, I just want to say thank you. It was really great to get to read the research, and I look forward to the questions at the end. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Cale. It's really, this event to me is a really exciting opportunity to bring together what I think is just absolutely, really great research with the perspective of practitioners about what schools may want to consider, how they interpret the findings, sort of what it leads them to think about. So in just a moment, we're going to... Yep,
if
go
I
ahead,
can interrupt, I had one quick thought. I had just seen one of the questions on the chat bar about whether or not the study kind of gives online learning a bad name. And I felt actually that nothing is perfect, and online learning is a very new medium, a new way to provide instruction and learning for our students. And I think the more we research it, the more we can refine it, the better, and the more we can try new things and learn from each other. I think it only will help us get better as we move forward. So I just wanted to add that in.
Oh, thanks very much for that. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why we want to bring together researchers and practitioners is to talk about the research that that AIR and its collaborators who work very closely with the Chicago Public School System identified as a valuable study, and to talk about sort of what we've learned from it and where we can take it and how we think it can inform our efforts to improve practice and inform future research. So that's really great. So let's see. Okay, I want to switch over quickly to Michelle, one of our just great members of the Virtual Education Research Alliance. And as she's talking, as you all have additional thoughts about what you think the study may tell us about how we can think about possibly modifying what may be typical practice in online learning, or what it just sort of makes you think about in terms of how we should be thinking about supporting students taking online courses, please feel free to put that in the chat section, and I'm going to hand it over to Michelle.
Thank you, Peggy, and good afternoon, everyone. Really, as Peggy said, we want to hear your input on the chat on what you think schools should consider before using credit recovery courses. And in participating in research and sharing what we are discovering, for us really has helped validate what we are doing, bring up items we may not have thought of, and really form some professional networks of support that can make all these considerations that seem overwhelming sometimes a little bit more manageable from our perspective. One of the things that I know is I wish I would have been at least more aware of and involved with research when I was the director of our Technology Alternatives Plus program that utilized some online options to meet the needs of at-risk students and fulfill a state statute. And today I want to highlight some of those for you. They may be some items that you're mentioning in the chat as we go on here this afternoon. And they may be some that are new to you that we have utilized in our experience in our program. And I also wanted to take some time just to share some resources of support for you to use in your initiatives too. One of the things that a lot of people don't realize is that there are 26 state virtual schools providing supplemental online courses through partnerships with districts in their state. And in Wisconsin, we have Wisconsin Virtual School, but then we have even a larger collaborative that called the Wisconsin Digital Learning Collaborative that provides a single point for schools to access quality online courses, digital resources, and then just pathways for online and blended learning. And this includes credit recovery. One of the resources I want to put in the chat here for you is the recent iNACOL Keeping Pace document. This will let you know if there is such a program and what resources might be available to you in your particular state. Today, there is a lot more buzz that I hear about personalized learning and educational plans for every student. I guess I like to think sometimes we might have been a little bit ahead of our time in our TAPS program, or our Technology Alternatives Plus, because we really encouraged the use of long-range learning plans for students. And credit recovery and catching students up and getting them back on pace for graduation was just one piece of the puzzle. We also were truly looking at what the students' interests were, where their passions lied, trying to connect them with real-world experiences, service learning, citizen action projects, and in the online courses, incorporating some social and emotional skill development, as well as looking at the return back to the regular ed classroom and next step after high school. Really, we wanted to look at that whole child and not just this one experience as a standalone experience. And in order to do that, what we found, and this is a consideration, is one size doesn't fit all. And so in our case, we couldn't just use one curriculum or one content from one provider. It wasn't just one device. And it wasn't just digitizing what we had been doing in the face-to-face classroom. So as Kale mentioned, there are more options now than ever before. This can seem a little bit scary, but remember there's support there. And one of the questions we get asked often is, what were we looking for that we really found made the online credit recovery solutions effective? And a lot of them were mentioned here today, but we really needed that teacher that was trained and was a content expert, along with a local mentor that was supporting that student. You wanted that rigorous and engaging curriculum, which meant that it was using kind of pedagogical methods to accommodate varying learning styles, but also had the opportunity or options for students to demonstrate or show that they had mastered a concept. So we wanted some pre and post diagnostic tools, whether it was at the full course level or at the unit level per se, so that we could track progress and have reporting tools so that teachers could intervene, assist, enrich, and they could do this at the individual level, group, or whole students. And in some cases, we know our students are all a little bit different, so they would want to be able to change sometimes those thresholds for mastery. And this provided that flexibility, and flexibility for students, and options were key for their buy-in and their ownership often to complete. One of the things that we found success with was something we like to call gradual release. I heard Kale mention it. I've seen it in the chat by some of the participants here this afternoon, is how do we bring or check on students' skills? So having them report to a certain location so we know they can access technology, they have basic tech skills down, and they have an understanding of how to communicate and with whom, and then letting them go. Then pulling them back in for additional support and maybe just a second gradual release if they're not on pace or they're not logging in on a regular basis. I mean, the support system for the online student is really broad, and it really is a team effort, and this is my opinion here, but it's a big team. I mean, it's the school board, that administration, you have your IT department, you have special ed, and let's not forget those parents. One quick way to turn a student off, we have discovered in an online course before they even get started, is to not have a plugin loaded so they can even view content, or maybe not having an appropriate device for the student to use. And maybe there hasn't been communication about an IEP to the teacher before the student is enrolled and beginning to work. We also need to remember that in the online world, we're dealing with board members and administration that are making policy decisions, financial decisions, and evaluating these options that maybe have not experienced this environment themselves, as long as the parents. So it really is a big support not only for the students, but support and professional development for the full team as well. iNACOL just published a document called mentoring versus monitoring that I want to paste in the chat. And it really talks about this role and how important that mentor role can be. And Wisconsin Virtual School is also a member of a multi-state virtual leadership alliance, and our partner, Michigan Virtual School, developed a mentor guide that they have shared with a number of states that I think all of you would find as a great resource for that person in that role. But again, that professional learning, that building up of your team, that broad team that includes parents too, think about resources that may be at your fingertips and send teams to those resources. One of them that we used in our state was our National At-Risk Education Network chapter. And you may have a chapter that's in your state as well. Since in our TAPS program we had 2 different Native American tribes, we would attend cultural conferences that would help us make connections to those populations. We also incorporated a behavioral strategist because often the life and skills of students needed to be developed related to social and emotional skills, and the behavioral strategist helped us integrate those into the content every day. The last consideration I really, really want to stress is expectations related to that teacher role and kind of the types and modes of communication that help them. And this is important because they need to have an online presence and they need to connect with students in a personal way. I mean, students really appreciate their teacher knowing them and connecting the content to their interests, to place it in a context that is relative to them and makes sense. Yes, they need their teacher to monitor their progress and utilize data to intervene for that just-in-time support, and they also need that formative feedback for continuous improvement. But this can't really be the only time that they hear from their online teachers. First, as an online teacher, speaking from experience, you can't have your contact information in enough places. We require teachers to communicate early through a welcome phone call and or email, and make sure to bring the parents and the mentors in the loop. Students need a connection with their teachers in a positive light and to hear what they are doing well prior to starting to tackle what needs to be worked on. And we also want teachers just to invite students to share about themselves, because this really provides us as educators an opportunity to, again, better connect real-world relevant content and opportunities to their interests. Response time, this was mentioned earlier. 24 hours is our response time for emails, but I will tell you this, students will say that isn't fast enough sometimes. 48 hours for formative feedback, and we also require weekly progress reports to connect with students. And we encourage the use of the synchronous conferencing tool for optional activities like Japanese club, or maybe meet your state representative, and provide those teachers with flexibility to use other social media to engage students. Again, lots of considerations, and thank you for all the items that you put down in the chat. And we just really want to emphasize, in reviewing this research discussed today and us becoming involved in research ourselves, it really has begged or made us at least ask the questions, are we asking the right questions? Are we collecting, or do we have access to data that we need? And is what we are doing making a difference? And how can we really go about validating that? I will say there was a time prior to my first involvement in research where I kind of felt a little bit alone, I would say, and a little bit overwhelmed by the thought of research, but I have learned and discovered is there are researchers out there and partners who will help you design research, determine what data we should collect to help us answer our burning questions and really validate our efforts. And we look forward to contributing to this relatively new field of research, and I encourage all of you to become a part of it too. So thank you, and I am going to turn things back to Peggy.
Michelle, thanks so much. Listen, there's been a pretty interesting discussion in the chat between Jessica and Susan. And I'm going to ask Jessica to just sort of give, for those people who weren't following it online, Jessica, maybe you want to take a second and just make some of the points that you made in the chat to the group verbally, please?
Sure, I'd be glad to. And I think there's some intersections with what Michelle is, calling to focus on, and in terms of thinking about asking key questions and moving in a direction where we're collecting information that, leads to improvement in all aspects of teaching and learning, and in particular, in this case, in online teaching and learning. And so what Susan and I have been talking about and exchanging some information about is thinking about the information that we have from this study, other studies that we've done, and then other studies that others have done about the opportunities that students have for face-to-face instruction from a qualified math teacher, in the case of an algebra course, while they're taking an online course, and how this clearly overlaps with sort of emerging sense that blended models may have more promise, particularly for students who need more support or may not be motivated or may not have taken online courses before and aren't used to the mode. And this overlaps with questions that came earlier in the webinar about opportunities that students in the online course may have had for tutoring, what happened with kids who didn't have the prerequisite skills to jump right in. So I think there are a lot of really converging issues that have come up in here, some of which our study can shed some light on, some of which just require additional research or turning to other places. And so what we've been talking about is what we know in our study is that by natural design, not created by us in terms of the research design, that about half of the mentors, the in-class mentors, were math teachers, and about half of them were not. And schools chose. So a challenge for us is that the schools that had math teachers as in-class mentors, and Kirk, feel free to jump in as well, they're noticeably different to us in terms of schools that didn't choose math teachers as the mentors. So it's hard for us to make good, reliable comparisons that you can all be confident in when we just focus on the online course sections, to say that students had different experiences or different outcomes in classrooms where the mentors were math teachers versus those who were not, because it wasn't something that we had all controlled in the study. But it is really interesting and important for the study to think about the different practices that mentors did, what they did in the context of their job. It varied a lot. We collected daily log data from the mentors, so they reported on what they did with all of their time. So we have a pretty good sense of some of the support that they gave to students in terms of face-to-face content support. Like in an earlier online algebra study, I mentioned this in the chat, that Kirk and I had the opportunity to conduct with Peggy and her team at EDC in an earlier study where we were focused on rural schools and expanding access to 8th grade algebra. Like in that study, we don't see, and hopefully in some of your work you do increasingly or in different ways, a lot of communication, data-driven communication, to point to something that Michelle pointed out, between online teachers and in-class proctors or mentors about what students need, where they are, where they should go, and what additional work they could do. So we saw some mentors in this Chicago study take the initiative to pull kids aside individually or in groups to teach them some pre-algebra or to teach them some first semester algebra content. We don't have great data on that. It's mostly anecdotal and in the logs, but what they actually taught or did is what we don't have great data on. So I think we're all in agreement that it's of critical importance to really understand the nature of the relationship and how it could improve and grow between online teachers and in-class mentors or proctors, especially when they're remote and they don't meet face-to-face, and finding ways of supporting them through web-based means and other ways for them to share information about students and really kind of provide multi-tiered support. And lots of you could add to this. Peggy, Kirk, others should feel free to jump in. And I know we're running short on time, but it is such an important point, and it's been really great to participate in this conversation and hear these threads throughout the presentations from Kale and Michelle, and in the chat boxes with Susan and many others.
So before I build on Jessica's comment, I'm going to do two things. One, I'm going to point out verbally the link to the survey. Please, before you leave us today, please take a moment to give us some feedback on the survey. It's important to us, and it's important to the Department of Education, who funds actually both the study Jessica did and the REL work. So please take a moment. Kirk, did you want to build on anything Jessica said before I jumped in? I guess no.
I think he's on mute.
Yeah, so one of the things that I just, that Jessica was talking about, and I just want to build on some more, is, the fact that we saw in the virtual algebra study, the study that looked at using an online course to expand access to mostly rural 8th graders, to this course. Or actually, I say the real importance, but what I should say is the fact that the students in the online course, for the most part, had a great deal of support from a teacher who was in the classroom. And, I think it really speaks to, I know this is true for Iowa Learning Online, as well as, Michelle and her colleagues at Wisconsin Virtual School. They spend a great deal of time communicating with schools about the importance of making sure that there are different support structures in place for kids who are enrolled in online schools. One of the things the Virtual Research Alliance has focused on from the beginning of our time together is the fact that there are really multiple educator roles that need to be paying attention to and supporting students' success in online courses, starting with the building administrator, the person who's going to put together the infrastructure that's going to make sure that there is a good choice of online course, that there is support for the student in the class, is support for the student who's enrolled in the online course, to the online teacher, and to an on-site monitor or facilitator. Let's see, are there any, I haven't seen any questions in a while, but again, I just want to, reiterate, a couple of comments that I made earlier that, I think this has been a really great and really very interesting session because it's given us a chance to look at, what I think is a very strong study that's been conducted in just a really rigorous and thoughtful way that reflects what we know is typical practice in a lot of schools, or what we know is typical practice in a lot of schools across the United States. And then, coupled that with opportunities from to hear from practitioners about how they're thinking about their work and providing students enrolled in online courses the kinds of support that they need to be successful. Actually, I think we might have one more minute. Jessica, I know I'm kind of putting you on the spot, but just really quickly, what does this make you think about in terms of like the next study you'd really like to conduct?
Yeah, I think there are many studies that we should all collaborate on and continue to build these lines of work. This area is so ripe for opportunity to learn really quickly because making use of technology infrastructure that's increasingly building to test out, both for researchers and practitioners, but ideally in partnership together, different models, different approaches. I don't mean long-term models. I mean, different presentations of content, different forms of adaptive opportunities to learn. We've talked a lot about prerequisite skills and did students have them and what happened if they didn't. And so, really, I think, continued work, there's been a lot of it going on in different places, and but continued work that's more widespread in K-12 schools that practitioners can be part of and access, that looks at different ways of supporting students through broadening their online learning opportunities with an eye toward, when does face-to-face make most sense. So I think that this session has definitely given us additional ideas for thinking about the different mentor practices that we can capture and quantify, and trying to get further than we have in understanding, which are the key factors that may support student learning more, and then, going from there to design a study that may help us with more confidence look at the role of those factors. And we've talked about that before, building on this work and other work, in terms of online teacher and mentor communications and relationships, and how, or face-to-face teacher and online teacher, what does blended learning really mean? So I think there are multiple studies that we can and should do, and we're focused here on Algebra I. We think it's a really great place to focus, but there are other subject areas too. So we're happy to hear your ideas if you're on the webinar and you want to talk about, partnering together and, exchanging some ideas. We'd love it, and in partnership with the REL as well.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Jessica. Okay, Pam, why don't you finish us up? Thanks very much.
I'd be happy to, and I think we have a lifetime of work now for Jessica and Kirk just based on what was in chat. So it would be wonderful if we could pull everybody in the room and say, okay, what questions do you have that you want researchers to take care of? And I've learned a lot today. Again, a reminder, please complete the survey. It just really helps us to develop these types of webinars in the future. So if you have feedback, thoughts, this doesn't have to be the last one around this particular topic. And also, we invite you to communicate with Peggy and with me about the work that our Virtual Education Research Alliance, the work with Wisconsin Virtual School and with Iowa Learning Online and Kirkwood, those types of programs are ongoing. And if you want to be kept in the loop as we're progressing with that work, we have our email addresses up on the screen. Thank you, everyone, so much today for your time. Please complete the survey, and we hope to talk to you soon. Thanks. Bye-bye.